Dry Gulch, New Mexico Territory, 1889, was the sort of place where the wind carried more gossip than rain. The street was a hard ribbon of dust, framed by false front buildings whose paint had long since given up the fight against the sun. Men spat tobacco into the dirt, women walked quick with their bonnets pulled low, and every pair of eyes seemed to follow Amos Rourke as he stepped off the boardwalk and pushed open the sheriff's office door. Sheriff McCall was hunched over his desk, going through a pile of papers. His silver star caught the light from the single front window. He looked up, chewing slowly on a toothpick. "Amos," he said, voice as dry as the desert outside. "You're late." "I had to drive the cattle in," Amos replied, removing his hat and tapping it against his leg. He was a tall man with sun-leathered skin, a jaw set like it had been carved from stone, and eyes the color of storm clouds over the prairie. MC Call pushed a document across the desk. "That's the last notice from the bank. You're 3 months behind on your payments, and they ain't interested in excuses. The Rourke spread's worth more than the cattle you got left, and if they foreclose." He let the sentence hang in the air like smoke. "I know what it means," Amos muttered, eyes scanning the paper. "That's why I sent for you," the sheriff continued, leaning back in his chair. "Silas Whitley's made an offer. He'll pay off every cent you owe and see to it you keep the ranch. All you gotta do is marry his daughters." Amos' brow furrowed. "Daughters, as in both of them?" "That's what it says." Amos laughed once, sharp and humorless. "McCall, you must be out of your mind. I ain't a man who buys a wife, let alone two." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Ain't saying it's right, Amos, but times are lean, and Silas, well, he's looking to secure his girl's future. You know about Clara, blind since birth. Hattie lost her hearing after the fever to Winter's back. Silas thinks you can give him a safe home, and he's willing to pay for it." Amos turned toward the window, watching dust swirl in the street. He'd known the Whitley sisters by sight. Clara, the elder, moved through town with a straight spine and a cane in hand, her unseeing eyes pale but proud. Hattie, younger by a few years, was quieter, her face soft and open, her movements careful. They were women who drew whispers, some pity, some admiration. "This ain't a charity house," Amos said flatly. McCall's tone softened. "It's survival, Amos. You keep the ranch. They get a man to stand between em and a world that ain't always kind. You could do worse." Amos didn't answer right away. He thought of the Rourke land, the weathered barn his father had built with his own hands, the windmill that creaked in the night, the small hill where his family lay buried. His father's voice came back to him from years ago, telling him, "A man's land is his backbone. Lose that, and you lose yourself." But the West had its own way of testing a man's pride. That night, Amos sat at the kitchen table of his empty ranch house, a single lamp throwing shadows against the log walls. He poured a cup of coffee, black as tar, and stared at the tin cup as though it might hold an answer. Outside, coyotes yipped in the distance, and the wind rattled the loose shutters. He imagined strangers driving his cattle, tearing down the old corral, maybe even burning the Rourke brand into another man's herd. It twisted his gut. Pride or survival. By dawn, he rode into town and knocked on Silas Whitley's door. The land baron stood there in his waistcoat, smug as a cat in the cream. "I'll take the deal," Amos said, voice steady. Silas' smile was thin and sharp. "Good. We'll have the wedding in a week." Amos tipped his hat, turned, and walked away. Every step felt heavier, like the West itself had just laid a burden across his shoulders. But he told himself one thing as he mounted his horse: the Rourke ranch would live on, even if it meant sharing it with two women he barely knew. And somewhere deep down, in the part of him he didn't like to admit existed, Amos wondered if, maybe, just maybe, there was more to this bargain than land and money. The Whitley Ranch was a grand place by Dry Gulch standards, to full stories of whitewashed boards, a wraparound porch with a swing, and a front yard fenced in with freshly painted rails. On the morning of the wedding, the porch was crowded with townsfolk who had ridden out just to see the spectacle. They didn't bother hiding their curiosity. Inside, Amos Rourke stood stiff in the parlor, the air thick with the smell of furniture polish and roses. His best shirt felt tight across his shoulders, and the collar rubbed against his neck. He tugged at it more than once, earning a glare from Silas Whitley, who was dressed like a banker on a Sunday. "Try not to look like a man headed to his own hanging," Silas muttered. Amos didn't answer. His eyes drifted toward the staircase, where the sisters were about to make their entrance. Clara came first, tall, poised, and holding a carved wooden cane. Her gown was ivory lace, high-necked, and buttoned to the throat. Her dark hair was swept into a neat knot, and her unseeing eyes stared straight ahead. If she was nervous, her voice didn't show it when she said, "Mr. Rourke, HMAM," Amos said awkwardly, tipping his head. Behind her came Hattie, dressed in a pale blue gown with a skirt that swayed lightly as she walked. Her hair was braided with wildflowers, the soft pinks and yellows standing out against her honey-brown hair. Her smile was small, but genuine, though her eyes darted to Amos with a hint of shyness. She signed something quickly with her fingers, a motion Amos didn't understand, then looked to Clara, who nodded for her. "She says hello." Clara translated without missing a beat. "Hello." Amos replied, his voice low, unsure if she could read his lips. Hattie's smile warmed. The preacher was already waiting in the grand sitting room, which had been rearranged for the ceremony. Chairs lined the walls, leaving an open space in the center. A few important men from town, Silas' business partners, and half the local gossips had gathered. The windows let in the sharp winter sunlight, which cut long rectangles across the polished wood floor. The preacher looked uncertain as he glanced between Amos and the two women. "Now, this here is a union unusual in most places." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room. Amos' jaw tightened. "Mr. Amos Rourke," the preacher began, "do you take these women, Clara Whitley and Hattie Whitley, to be your lawful wedded wives, to honor, protect, and provide for in sickness and in health?" "I do," Amos said, voice steady though the words felt heavy. "Miss Clara Whitley, do you take Mr. Rourke?" "I do," Clara answered firmly. "Miss Hattie Whitley." Hattie's lips moved in a soft, almost whispered "I do," and she smiled as the preacher turned back to his book. When the ceremony ended, Silas wasted no time in shaking Amos' hand. "They're now, business and family, tied neat as a calf rope." Clara extended her hand next. Her grip was firm, her voice sharp. "If you treat us like charity, Mr. Rourke, you'll regret it." Hattie approached quietly, her eyes meeting Amos with something gentler. She reached out and touched his sleeve, fingers resting there for just a moment, as if testing the steadiness of the man she had just married. They stepped outside into the pale winter sunlight, where the wind carried the mixed sounds of polite applause from a few hands and hushed gossip from far more lips. "Two wives," someone muttered near the fence line. "That Rourke's either a genius or a damn fool." Another voice replied, "Mark my words, he won't see spring without trouble." Amos helped Clara into the wagon first, then Hattie. As he climbed onto the driver's bench, he caught sight of Silas standing on the porch, arms crossed, watching them leave like a man who had just moved to chess pieces exactly where he wanted them. The wagon wheels crunched over the frost-hardened dirt. Amos kept his eyes on the horizon, his mind running faster than the team. Behind him, Clara sat straight and quiet, her gloved hands folded neatly. Hattie hummed something under her breath, a sound she could not hear, the soft melody floating in the cold air. The ranch house came into view, standing alone against the vast spread of prairie. Amos felt the weight of the moment settle deep in his chest. They had crossed the threshold of law and promise, but not yet the threshold of trust, and somewhere, in the quiet between the three of them, he sensed the start of something neither love nor hate, something far more unpredictable. The wagon wheels rattled over the frozen ground, carrying Amos, Clara, and Hattie away from the Whitley Ranch and into the open stretch of prairie. The wind was sharp enough to cut through a man's coat, but the sky was a clear, endless blue. Amos kept his eyes on the horizon, hands tight on the reins. He could feel the weight of the two women behind him, one sitting straight and still as a fence post, the other shifting now and then, her skirt brushing lightly against the bench. When the Rourke Ranch came into view, it stood lonely but proud. A wide, low house of timber and stone, a barn with a weathered red roof, and a scattering of corrals. Beyond that stretched miles of land, the only thing Amos had ever truly called his own. He helped Clara down first. She found her footing. With her cane, her boots crunching in the frosted dirt. "It smells like cedar," she said, tilting her head toward the house. "I like that." Hattie followed, her eyes sweeping the yard, the barn, the empty clothes line flapping in the wind. She touched Amos' sleeve and pointed toward the barn. He nodded. "Yeah, that's where the cattle shelter is." She gave a small smile, though. He wondered how much of his words she caught without watching his lips dot inside. The house felt colder than the outside air. Amos had lived alone too long to keep it warm without effort. A single rug covered the plank floor, and the stone fireplace was dark. He set about lighting a fire, feeling the silence grow heavier with each passing minute. Clara broke it first. "Do you have a room for each of us?" "Upstairs," Amos said, tossing another log onto the flames. "To bedrooms, one across from the other. There's quilts on the beds, not much else." "That will do," she said crisply. Hattie wandered toward the mantel, where a row of small carved horses stood. She picked one up, running her fingers along its smooth back, then glanced toward Amos. He tried to smile, but it felt clumsy. The first few days were a tangle of mismatched routines. Clara rose early, somehow finding her way to the kitchen without trouble, and took charge of the ledger books stacked on the table. She ran her fingertips over the ink lines, committing them to memory, then began asking pointed questions about cattle numbers and supply costs. Amos wasn't used to explaining his business to anyone, least of all a woman who couldn't see the herd herself, but she had a sharp mind, and he found himself giving honest answers. Hattie spent her mornings outside, tending the small, winter garden Silas had insisted they bring with them, a few stubborn greens in boxes and barrels. She also took to feeding the chickens, her quiet movements calming the skittish birds. Amos caught her humming more than once, though the sound was soft and uneven, almost more of a vibration than a melody. By the week's end, the house was running smoother, though not without tension. One evening, as Amos returned from the range, he found Clara sitting at the kitchen table with her arms crossed. "You spent $20 more than you should have on feed," she said. "I got a better quality," he replied, pulling off his gloves, "and paid for it with money." "We don't have," she countered. He bristled. "We? Yes, we," she said firmly. "I may not see the herd, Mr. Rourke, but I can keep this ranch from going under." "That's more than your pride will do." Before Amos could reply, Hattie stepped between them, placing a hand on Clara's arm and another on Amos' sleeve. Her eyes moved between them in quiet insistence, and somehow her presence broke the sharpness in the air. Amos stepped back, letting out a slow breath. "Maybe you're right," he admitted to Clara. That night, after the dishes were washed and the fire banked, Amos sat in the rocker near the hearth. Clara was sewing in her chair, Hattie mending a small tear in one of his shirts. The house still felt unfamiliar with their presence, but he realized it was no longer cold. It wasn't warmth from the fire alone. It was something else, something he couldn't name yet. Winter's bite had settled deep over Dry Gulch by mid-January. The wind carried knives of cold through the gaps in barn walls, and the sky seemed to press low over the prairie. Amos Rourke had spent the morning breaking ice in the cattle troughs when he decided to ride into town for supplies. Clara had reminded him twice about the price of flour and beans, while Hattie had packed him a small bundle of cornbread wrapped in cloth. The main street of Dry Gulch was half buried in wind-blown snow. Amos hitched his horse outside the general store and stamped the frost from his boots. Before stepping inside, the warmth was welcome, the air smelling of coffee, kerosene, and burlap sacks. He had just finished paying for a barrel of salt when the door banged open behind him, letting in a gust of icy air and trouble. Cole Maddox stepped in with 2 men at his heels, all 3 dusted with snow. Maddox was a tall, lean man with a grin that never reached his eyes. Amos knew him from Dodge City years back, when Maddox ran with a crew that solved problems with bullets instead of words. "Well, I'll be," Maddox drawled, spotting Amos. "If it ain't Rourke himself. Heard you been busy, heard you married yourself to wives." The room went still. Old man Harper behind the counter kept his head down, fussing with a jar of nails. "Not your concern," Amos said flatly. Maddox stepped closer, his boots crunching on the grit. 2 wives and a rich father-in-law. Must be sittin' pretty. And me and my boys, well, we've been ridden lean this winter. Thought maybe we could lighten your load." Amos' hand itched for the cold at his hip. "You try it, Maddox, and you'll find I've gotten better since Dodge." The outlaw chuckled low. "We'll be comin' by. Rourke, best have something ready for us." They brushed past him on their way out, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the jars on the shelves. By the time Amos rode home, the sky was already dimming toward night. The wind carried more than cold now. It carried the sense of something circling, waiting. Inside, Clara was at the table sorting coins into neat stacks, her head turning sharply at the sound of his boots. "You've got enemies?" she asked without preamble. "Old debts," Amos muttered, setting down the bundle of supplies. They ride with new faces now. Hattie, standing near the stove, looked between them. Amos made the mistake of thinking he didn't need to explain, but she stepped forward, touched his arm, and signed something quickly. Clara translated. "She wants to know if they're coming here." "Yes," Amos admitted. "I reckon they are." Clara tapped her fingers against the wood of the table, the sound sharp and deliberate. "Then we'd better be ready." Amos studied her face, the blind woman who could still somehow read danger like a printed notice. Then his gaze shifted to Hattie, who had already crossed to a small chest by the wall. She knelt, lifted the lid, and pulled out a worn pistol. "My father gave this to me," Clara said, hearing the sound of the gun being laid on the table. "Hattie knows how to use it." Amos felt something stir in his chest, not surprise, exactly, but a deepening respect. He'd thought of them as to people he had to protect. Now he realized they might just be the kind of people you wanted beside you in a fight. That night, the 3 of them sat by the fire, cleaning rifles and counting ammunition. Outside, the snow whispered across the frozen ground, covering their tracks, hiding their walls. Somewhere out there, Maddox and his men were waiting for their chance. And Amos knew one thing for certain when they came. The Rourke Ranch would not be an easy prize. The wind howled over the plains for 2 days straight, carrying with it the dry sting of blowing snow. Amos spent most of that time shoring up the barn doors and making sure the cattle had enough feed to last through the cold spell. But his mind never left Maddox's grin in the general store, nor the promise hidden in his words. On the 3rd morning, The storm broke. The sky cleared to a pale blue, and the land lay under a glittering crust of frost. Amos was outside splitting wood when Hattie came running from the chicken coop, her braids swinging. She tugged at his sleeve and pointed toward the far pasture. At first, all Amos saw was the empty stretch of land. Then he spotted the thin trail of smoke curling into the cold air. "Damn it," he muttered, grabbing his rifle from the porch. By the time he and Hattie reached the far pasture, the smell hit him, scorched hay and singed leather. One of the small feed sheds was smoldering, its roof half collapsed. Tracks in the snow led away toward the ridge. Maddox hadn't bothered to hide them. Clara met them halfway back to the house, her cane tapping fast over the hard ground. "I smelled smoke," she said, her voice tight. "Was it them?" Amos nodded grimly. "Testing us. They didn't take anything, just wanted to send a message." "They've sent it," Clara replied. "And now we send one back." That evening, they sat at the table, a lantern casting long shadows over the worn wood. Clara's fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup while Hattie watched Amos closely. "They're not going to stop," Clara said. "They'll keep pushing until you give them what they want, which you won't. So we make it costly for them." Amos raised an eyebrow. "You suggesting we fight back?" "I'm suggesting," she said, "that we make this ranch harder to take than it's worth." They spent the next day preparing. Amos reinforced the barn with extra boards, set tripwires near the corrals, and moved the most valuable stock closer to the house. Clara organized their supplies and rationed ammunition. Hattie, surprisingly, proved the most resourceful in the field. She spotted a narrow gully near the creek where a man on horseback could be forced to slow. Perfect for an ambush. The attack came nights later. It started with the sound of horses in the dark, muffled hoof beats on frozen ground, drawing closer. Amos was already at the window, rifle in hand, when shadows detached themselves from the tree line. "They're here," he said. Hattie was beside him instantly, pistol ready. Clara stood near the hearth, calm as stone, listening. A shot cracked, the stillness splintering the porch rail. Amos returned fire, the muzzle flash lighting the snow in brief, violent bursts. One of Maddox's men yelped and tumbled from his saddle. The fight was quick but fierce. Hattie, crouched behind the water trough, fired twice and drove another rider back toward the ridge. Amos took a grazing shot to the arm but held his ground, working the rifle with steady hands. And then, silence. The horses' pounding faded into the distance. Amos stepped out onto the porch, scanning the darkness. Maddox hadn't been among the riders. This had been another test. But they'd bloodied him this time, and that would sting. Back inside, Clara was already tearing strips from an old sheet for Amos' arm. "You held them," she said quietly. "For now," Amos replied. Hattie set her pistol on the table, her cheeks flushed but her eyes steady. She signed something to Clara, who smiled faintly and translated. "She says next time they'll aim for the house." Amos met both their gazes. "Then next time," he said, "we make sure they don't get that close." The morning after the attack, the ranch lay under a brittle silence. The snow was marred with hoofprints and blood, but the air was still. Amos had seen fights go like this before. The pause before someone made their next move. While Amos checked the cattle, Clara sat at the kitchen table, her fingertips brushing over the paper where she kept accounts. "They weren't here to win last night," she said when he returned. "They wanted to see how far you'd go to protect this place." "I went far enough," Amos muttered, setting his rifle by the door. "Not far enough for Maddox," Clara countered. "He's testing you, and when a man like that runs out of tests, he moves straight to taking." Hattie, mending a torn saddle strap in the corner, glanced up. She signed quickly, her hands sharp and deliberate. Clara's lips pressed into a thin line as she translated. She thinks they'll try something we won't expect. That prediction proved right by sundown. It started with a column of smoke, thick and black, curling up from the far end of the property. Amos saddled his horse, but before he could ride out, a gunshot rang from the hills. A bullet kicked snow at his boots. He pulled back instantly, ducking behind the fence. Maddox had posted men as sharpshooters, pinning him to the house while the smoke rose higher. It wasn't one of the sheds this time. It was the hay store, the heart of winter feed. They're trying to starve us out, Amos said, teeth gritted. Clara didn't flinch. Then we make sure it's not worth their time to keep trying. That night, Amos and Hattie rode out under the cover of darkness. Keeping low in the saddle, Clara had drawn them a mental map from memory, based on the way Maddox's men had approached before. They found 2 of his riders camped near a frozen creek, their horses tethered loosely to a cottonwood. Amos signaled Hattie. She moved like a shadow, slipping behind the camp. One quick snip of rope sent the horses bolting into the dark. The startled outlaws scrambled, cursing, but by the time they'd grabbed rifles, Amos had fired 2 warning shots over their heads. It wasn't much, but it sent a message: we can hit you. To back at the ranch, Clara was waiting by the fire. You didn't kill them, she observed. No, Amos replied, hanging his coat. But they'll think twice before they sleep easy. Clara tilted her head toward him. You don't win against a man like Maddox by making him think twice. You win by making him leave. The next day, they began turning the ranch into a trap. Amos set up false trails through the snow, leading to dead ends where he could see without being seen. Hattie scattered broken glass in likely approach paths, hidden under fresh powder. Clara took charge of storing food and water inside the main house, preparing for a siege. That night, while the wind rattled the shutters, Amos sat cleaning his rifle. Maddox won't wait much longer, he said. Next time, he'll come himself. Clara's blind eyes fixed on the firelight. Then when he does, she said, we make sure he doesn't leave. The way she said it, calm as a prayer, made Amos glance at her longer than he meant to, for all her quiet and her careful words. Clara was not the sort to bend underweight, and Hattie, polishing her pistol nearby, wasn't either. For the first time since this started, Amos felt something dangerous in his chest, not fear, not even anger. It was the cold, certain knowledge that if Maddox came in force, this little ranch would meet him with teeth. Dawn came sharp and cold, the kind of morning where sound carried far over the plains. Amos was already outside feeding the cattle when he heard it, the low rumble of hooves. Not a couple of riders this time, many. He stepped onto the porch and scanned the ridge. Against the pale sunrise, dark silhouettes poured over the crest. A dozen at least. Maddox rode at the head, tall in his black duster, his grin visible even at a distance. They're here, Amos called into the house. Clara appeared in the doorway, her cane in one hand. Then it ends today. Hattie joined them, her pistol strapped to her thigh, eyes narrowed. Maddox reined up 30 yards from the porch. Mornin', Amos, he called. Thought I'd come collect what you owe me. I don't owe you a damn thing. Amos replied, that's where you're wrong. Maddox's tone was lazy, but his men were already spreading out, rifles in hand. You got 2 choices, walk away, or get buried under your own snow. Amos didn't answer. Instead, he glanced at Hattie, who gave the smallest nod. The first shot cracked from the ridge to their left, one of Amos's traps. A buried tin can filled with powder and rock salt went off with a flash and a roar, spooking Maddox's flank riders. Horses reared, men swore, and in that moment Amos opened fire. The fight was chaos. Hattie moved fast, darting between cover, her pistol barking in short, controlled bursts. Amos worked his rifle methodically, every shot aimed to drive them back, rather than kill. Maddox's men weren't expecting resistance this organized, not from 3 people. Then Maddox himself charged. His horse pounded over the snow, straight for the porch. Amos dropped his rifle, drew his Colt, and met him head-on. They fired almost at the same time. Amos's shot ripped Maddox's hat clean off, while Maddox's bullet tore into the porch, post inches from Clara's head. Clara didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise like a whip. "Maddox." Something in the way she said it made him pull his horse short. "You've been circling this place like a wolf," she said, her sightless gaze fixed on him. "But you're not half the predator you think. You've already lost men, horses, and time. You stay here, you lose more, and you know what for. Not the land, not the cattle. For the pride of taking what isn't yours. For a moment, the only sound was the wind." Maddox's men shifted uneasily. The truth of it sat heavy in the air. Amos saw the cracked form in Maddox's confidence. Hattie must have seen it too, because she stepped out from cover, pistol still ready, and signed something sharp and deliberate. Clara smiled faintly and translated for Maddox's benefit. She says, "You can ride away now and keep your teeth, or stay and spit them into the snow." Maddox's grin faltered. He looked from Amos's steady aim, to Hattie's unblinking stare, to Clara's calm certainty. Then he spat into the snow. "Mount up." He told his men in less than a minute. The riders were gone, their shapes shrinking against the white horizon. The silence after was almost louder than the fight. Amos let out a slow breath and holstered his Colt. "You two," he said to Clara and Hattie, "are more dangerous than a dozen rifles." Clara tilted her head with a faint smile. "We had to be. Men like Maddox don't leave room for anything else." Hattie signed something quick, her eyes glinting. Clara laughed softly. "She says if you'd married us for our charm instead of our land, you'd have figured that out sooner." Amos chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess I'm a slow learner." As the 3 of them stood on that porch, the snow stretching untouched in all directions, Amos realized something Maddox never would. This ranch wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to all 3 of them, and together they'd made it a place no one could take.